Everyone laughed at the black lady in the restaurant, until the mob boss stood up and said this. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a busy evening at the upscale restaurant in the heart of the city. The air was filled with the rich scent of gourmet dishes and the soft clinking of fine china. The dim lighting and elegant decor set the perfect tone for a luxurious dinner, where the city's wealthiest individuals gathered to enjoy an evening of fine dining. At one of the tables, a group of well-dressed patrons was making their way through a 5-course meal, laughing and chatting. In the midst of their conversation, they caught sight of a woman passing by their table. She was dressed in the standard black uniform of the restaurant, carrying a tray of drinks, her eyes focused on the task at hand. It wasn't the first time she had been noticed by the guests, but this time, the comment made by one of the men at the table was different. Look at her, he said, laughing loudly. She looks like she doesn't belong here. Probably just another person who couldn't find a real job. The group chuckled, clearly enjoying the moment at her expense. The woman, whose name was Andrea, didn't react. She simply kept walking, her head held high, but her heart sinking a little with each word that landed on her ears. She had been through so much in her life, and yet, she still found herself in situations like this, where her worth was constantly being questioned. Andrea had been working at the restaurant for the past year, ever since she had moved to the city with hopes of starting over. Her past had been a tough one, full of struggles, but she was determined to build a better future for herself and her daughter. But no matter how hard she tried, it seemed like people like her were always invisible to those who had power, wealth, and privilege. As she approached the kitchen to deliver the drinks, she overheard more laughter from the table. She probably thinks she's better than us, just because she's carrying our drinks, one of the women said, sneering. Andrea felt her chest tighten, but she kept her composure. She had no choice but to take it all in silence. It was the price she had to pay to survive in this world, where the rich and powerful often treated people like her with disdain. But then, something unexpected happened. As Andrea made her way back to the dining room, the restaurant's front door opened with a force that turned heads. The man who walked in was unmistakable. He had a commanding presence, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that made him stand out from the crowd. He walked with an air of authority, his every step calculated, as if he owned the place. The room grew quieter as he passed through, his eyes scanning the area. He was none other than Marco Romano, a name known in the city for his connections to the most powerful mafia family in the area. Marco had his own table reserved for the night, but as he glanced around the room, his attention was drawn to the group laughing at Andrea. His eyes narrowed as he caught the tail end of their conversation. He could see Andrea standing near the kitchen, trying to avoid the ridicule, her hands clenched around the tray. His jaw tightened. He didn't like what he was hearing. Without a word, Marco walked towards the group. The chatter died down as he approached. The guests, realizing who he was, suddenly went quiet. Marco stopped in front of the table, his gaze sweeping over the people who had just moments ago been mocking Andrea. Is there a problem here? He asked in a calm, yet chilling voice. The guests froze, unsure of how to respond. One of the men at the table tried to speak, but his words faltered as Marco's gaze landed on him. I said, Marco repeated, his voice low and controlled. Is there a problem here? The man stammered, his face paling as the tension in the air thickened. Marco stood tall, his presence radiating power. The group exchanged nervous glances, realizing they were now in the presence of someone who wasn't afraid. To assert himself, Marco turned to Andrea, who was still standing near the kitchen, looking at the scene unfolding before her. His expression softened, and for the first time that evening, Andrea felt like she wasn't invisible. He gave her a small nod, a gesture that made her heart skip a beat. Then, he turned back to the group. I don't take kindly to people who disrespect others, Marco said, his voice steady, especially when they have no reason to. The group sat in stunned silence as Marco continued. You'll leave my restaurant now, and if I ever hear of any of you treating someone like that again, it will be the last time. He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving the group to process what had just happened. Andrea stood there, frozen in place, as the sound of Marco's footsteps faded into the background. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. Marco Romano, the feared mafia boss, had stood up for her in front of everyone. She had never expected this. Never thought that someone like him would ever care enough to step in and defend someone like her. The group was now visibly shaken, their previous confidence completely shattered. Andrea could hear their whispers as they tried to process the unexpected turn of events. What just happened? One of them muttered under his breath. Andrea couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. For once, she wasn't the one left to endure the mockery. For once, someone had taken a stand. And it felt powerful. The night had taken a strange turn, but Andrea wasn't complaining. She had never expected to be seen, let alone defended. But tonight, she had been. And that made all the difference. As the evening continued, the restaurant's atmosphere shifted. The once tense air that had filled the room after Marco Romano's sudden intervention began to dissipate, but Andrea's mind was still racing. The mob boss's unexpected defense had left her stunned, and she could hardly believe what had just happened. She moved about her duties, carrying drinks and clearing tables, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the moment when Marco had stepped in. Was it a fluke? A random act of kindness? Or was there more to it? She couldn't help but wonder. As she passed by Marco's table later in the evening, she dared a glance at him. He was sitting in the same spot, his dark eyes now focused on a glass of wine, looking as composed and unbothered as ever. But when his gaze met hers, he gave her a small nod, almost as if acknowledging the unspoken connection that had formed between them. Andrea quickly turned her head, feeling a strange heat rise in her cheeks. She had no idea why his attention affected her so much. He was a mafia boss, feared and respected by so many. And she was just a woman trying to make a living, one drink at a time. But there was something in the way he had looked at her, something that made her feel more than just invisible. It made her feel seen. Throughout the night, Andrea couldn't shake the feeling that things were different now. The guests at her table no longer treated her with the same mockery, and even the waitstaff seemed to offer her a new level of respect. It was as if the entire energy of the restaurant had changed in the wake of Marco's intervention. But just as Andrea began to think things might return to normal, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. She turned around to find Marco standing there, his towering figure blocking her path. She froze, unsure of what to do next. Marco had already left the restaurant earlier, after all. What was he doing here? I need to speak with you. Marco's voice was low, but his tone was unmistakably serious. Andrea's heart raced, and she couldn't hide the surprise in her eyes. She had never expected the mafia boss to seek her out after the scene earlier. Sure, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. What's this about? Marco glanced around the restaurant, his eyes scanning the area to ensure no one was within earshot. Not here, he said, his voice softer now, but with an edge of authority. Come with me. Without waiting for a response, Marco turned and began walking toward a private hallway in the back of the restaurant. Andrea hesitated for a moment, unsure of what was going on, but then followed him. As she walked behind him, she couldn't help but notice how effortlessly he moved through the space, as if the entire restaurant bent to his will. When they reached the back of the restaurant, Marco opened a door to a small, dimly lit room, motioning for Andrea to step inside. She did so hesitantly, her heart beating faster with every step. The door clicked shut behind them, and the quiet of the room only amplified her nerves. Marco turned to face her, his expression unreadable. I want to offer you a job, he said, his voice direct. A job? Andrea blinked, confused. I don't understand. Marco leaned against the desk in the corner of the room, crossing his arms over his chest. You're a smart woman, Andrea, he said, his gaze fixed on her. You handled yourself well tonight. The way you didn't react when those people humiliated you. I respect that. I see potential in you. Andrea felt a mix of emotions, surprise, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite place. Potential for what? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Marco's eyes softened slightly, but his gaze remained intense. I need someone who can think on their feet, he replied. Someone who isn't afraid to speak the truth, even when it's hard. I think you could be that person. Andrea's mind raced. What was he saying? Was he really offering her a job? It didn't make sense. She had never imagined that someone like Marco Romano would even consider someone like her for anything other than a brief, dismissive glance. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, her voice shaky. Marco stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, yet oddly reassuring. "I have my own business dealings," he explained, his voice lowering. "I need someone who can be discreet, who can navigate difficult situations with finesse. You showed that tonight." Andrea took a step back, trying to process what he was saying. "You want me to work for you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Marco nodded. "I can offer you more than just a job," he said, his tone now softer, almost coaxing. "I can offer you a chance to live a life beyond what you're used to. A life where you're respected, where you're seen." Andrea stared at him, unsure of what to make of his words. She had worked hard her entire life, struggling just to get by. But this was something she never thought she would be offered. She had no idea what Marco's intentions were, but one thing was clear. He was serious. "Think about it," Marco added, his gaze piercing. "This could change everything for you." Andrea felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had always dreamed of a life where she could provide more for her daughter, a life where she wouldn't have to constantly worry about money or being looked down upon. But this was a choice she never thought she would have to make. Could she really accept a job from someone like Marco Romano? What kind of life would it lead to? As she stood there, lost in thought, Marco turned and opened the door. "Take your time," he said, "but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often." With that, he stepped out of the room, leaving Andrea standing alone, unsure of what to do next. The next few days were a blur for Andrea. Marco's offer weighed heavily on her mind. She had spent countless hours working at the restaurant, struggling to make ends meet, constantly fighting the silent battle of being invisible. But now, here she was, being given an opportunity that could change everything. It was hard to believe, hard to imagine herself in a world where she wasn't just a waitress, but someone who had power, respect, and a future she could control. That night, after her shift ended, Andrea sat at her small apartment, the only place that truly felt like home. She ran her hands through her hair, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She knew this wasn't just about a job offer. It was a choice between two very different lives. One life was filled with uncertainty, hard work, and struggle. The other promised power, security, and respect, things she had always dreamed of but never thought were within her reach. The next day, Andrea made up her mind. She dressed in her nicest clothes, the ones she only wore for special occasions, and made her way to the address Marco had given her. The building was nothing like she had ever seen before. Tall, sleek, and impossibly luxurious, it seemed like something out of a movie. She hesitated at the entrance, taking a deep breath before walking through the doors. Inside, the lobby was grand, with polished marble floors, expensive art adorning the walls, and a sense of power that seemed to hum in the air. A receptionist at the front desk gave her a courteous nod, but didn't speak as Andrea made her way to the elevator. When the doors opened to the top floor, Andrea stepped out and was immediately greeted by one of Marco's men, a large figure in a suit who led her down a long corridor. They stopped in front of a set of double doors, and the man knocked before opening them. Inside, Marco sat behind a large desk, his face as unreadable as always. He looked up when Andrea entered, his eyes scanning her briefly before offering a slight smile. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice low but warm. Andrea stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. She had made her choice. "I've thought about it," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves running through her. "And I'm ready to take the job." Marco stood and walked around the desk to face her. His posture was calm, confident, and there was a certain intensity in his gaze that made Andrea's pulse race. "Good," he said. "This is just the beginning, Andrea. I'm not offering you this because you're just another employee. I'm offering you this because I see something in you. Something special." Andrea's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you see in me?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. Marco smiled, but it was more of a knowing smirk than anything else. "I see a woman who doesn't back down. A woman who is willing to stand up for herself, even when it's hard. You've already proven that in ways that most people wouldn't even begin to understand." His words made Andrea's heart flutter, but she quickly pushed that feeling aside. "I'm not here for flattery," she said, trying to keep her tone businesslike. Marco chuckled softly. No, you're not. But you're here because I think you have the potential to be more than just a waitress. I want you to be part of something bigger. Something that can give you power, influence, and a future where you call the shots. Andrea was silent for a moment, her mind racing as she processed his words. The offer was tempting, more tempting than anything she had ever imagined. But she knew she had to ask the question that had been on her mind since the moment he had first spoken to her. What do you want me to do? Marco walked over to a cabinet in the corner of the room, pulled out a file, and handed it to her. This is just the beginning. We have operations in this city, and I need someone I can trust to handle certain things. But I'm not going to throw you into the deep end right away. We'll start slow. I want you to observe, learn, and then we'll go from there. Andrea opened the file and scanned the papers inside. They were filled with details about various businesses, names, and deals that seemed way out of her league. But she had been in tough situations before, and she wasn't about to back down now. She looked up at Marco. I'm in, she said, her voice more confident than she felt. Marco's eyes glinted with approval. Good. I knew you had it in you. He paused for a moment, then added, but remember this, Andrea. You're not just working for me now. You're working for the family. And we take care of our own. That means loyalty, trust, and respect. If you're in, you'll get all of that. But if you're out, he let the sentence hang in the air, unspoken, yet fully understood. Andrea nodded, her resolve solidifying. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. I'm in, she repeated, more firmly this time. Marco smiled. Welcome to the team. As Andrea left his office, she felt a sense of anticipation building within her. This was the start of something new, something big. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she was ready to walk it. And for the first time in a long while, Andrea felt like she was in control of her own future. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind for Andrea. The reality of the decision she had made hit her with full force. Working for Marco Romano meant stepping into a world she had only heard whispers about. It was a world where power was everything, and trust was earned, not given. But as she settled into her new role, she quickly realized how much more complicated things were than she had imagined. Her first few days with Marco were spent in the background, observing the operations of his organization. She had been introduced to a few key figures, his inner circle, who were just as calculating and intimidating as Marco himself. They were all experts in their fields, running everything from logistics to finance, and their loyalty to Marco was unquestionable. Andrea was told to keep her head down, learn the ropes, and not to speak unless spoken to. The quiet observation suited her well, and she took it all in. The tense meetings, the undercurrent of danger that seemed to follow every transaction, and the way Marco held the room with nothing more than a few words. It was a world that moved at a pace Andrea wasn't used to, and she knew she had to adapt quickly if she was going to survive. Marco's trust was something she had to earn, and she wasn't about to waste the opportunity. It was a late afternoon when things took a turn. Marco called Andrea into his office. She had become familiar with the intimidating setting by now, the rich wood furniture, the cold steel of the desk, the panoramic view of the city that seemed to mirror the power he held. He was sitting at his desk when she entered, his dark eyes lifting to meet hers. You've been doing well, Marco said, his voice steady and calm. But now it's time to move beyond the shadows. Andrea stood in front of him, feeling the weight of his words. What do you mean? She asked, her heart racing slightly. Marco leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. It's time for you to take on more responsibility. You've been watching long enough. Andrea's mind raced. She had expected to stay in the background for much longer, but Marco clearly had other plans. I'm ready, she said, even though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. Marco nodded. Good. I need someone to handle a sensitive situation for me. There's a rival family trying to make a move into our territory, and we can't let that happen. I trust you to deal with it. Andrea's heart skipped a beat. The task sounded dangerous. She had seen the lengths to which Marco's family would go to protect their interests. But something inside her stirred. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the chance to prove herself. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice firm now. Marco smiled, a rare, approving smile that made her feel like she had truly earned something. There's a shipment coming in at the docks tomorrow. I need you to oversee it. Make sure everything goes smoothly, and if something goes wrong, handle it. Do what you have to do. Andrea felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it. This was her chance to show that she was more than just a waitress. She was a part of this world now, and Marco believed in her. I understand, she said, her mind already calculating what needed to be done. The next day, Andrea found herself at the docks. The cold, salty air stung her skin as she surveyed the scene. The shipment was large, and the docks were bustling with activity. Workers moved crates and containers with practiced ease, but Andrea was alert, her eyes scanning the area for anything out of place. She knew this was a test. Marco had given her this responsibility because he believed she could handle it, but she also knew there was no room for mistakes. She had seen the consequences of failure, and it wasn't something she wanted to experience firsthand. As she walked through the maze of containers, she was joined by one of Marco's men, Luca. He was a tall, muscular man with a reputation for being ruthless, but Andrea had learned to trust him. "Everything's set," Luca said, his voice low and steady. "We've got eyes on everything." Andrea nodded, but her instincts were still on high alert. "Make sure no one gets too close," she ordered, her voice sharp. Luca gave her a respectful nod and disappeared into the shadows. Andrea took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had a job to do, and she wasn't going to let anything go wrong. As she walked further into the dock area, she noticed a figure lurking near one of the containers. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't recognize him, but something about his presence felt off. She moved closer, her instincts telling her to be cautious. Just as she was about to call for backup, the man turned and made a swift move toward her. Before she could react, he was right in front of her. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket that concealed most of his features, but Andrea could see the glint of something dangerous in his eyes. "You're in the wrong place," he said, his voice low and threatening. Andrea didn't flinch. "I could say the same to you," she replied, her voice steady. She could feel the tension rising, but she kept her composure. The man took a step closer, but Andrea was faster. In a swift motion, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small weapon Marco had given her. She aimed it at the man, her fingers steady on the trigger. "I suggest you leave," she said calmly, her voice cold. The man paused, then slowly backed away, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't say another word as he turned and disappeared into the shadows. Andrea stood there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had handled the situation without hesitation, without fear. Marco's faith in her had been well placed, and she was beginning to feel the power that came with the role she had taken on. But she knew this was just the beginning. There would be more tests, more challenges ahead. And she was ready. Andrea's world had shifted dramatically in the past few weeks, and the weight of it was beginning to sink in. After the confrontation at the docks, she had proven herself capable, more capable than she had ever thought possible. Marco trusted her now, and that trust had pushed her to take on even more responsibilities within the family. She was no longer just an observer. She was an active participant in Marco's empire. But with that came new challenges. She spent long days at Marco's office, going over reports, attending meetings, and making decisions that affected the family's operations. It wasn't glamorous work, and it wasn't easy. But each day, Andrea felt herself growing stronger, more confident. She learned to navigate the complex world of power, influence, and business dealings, where trust was as valuable as money, and loyalty meant survival. But as she rose through the ranks, Andrea couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Marco had kept her in the loop with most of the family's dealings, but there were times when she felt like he was holding back, like there were things he wasn't telling her. Andrea knew better than to question him directly, but her instincts told her there was more to the story. One afternoon, as she was reviewing some files in Marco's office, she was interrupted by Luca, one of Marco's closest men. He walked in, quietly, as always, and gave her a respectful nod. "Marco wants to see you," he said, his expression unreadable. Andrea stood up, feeling a slight unease. She had seen Luca's stoic face countless times, but today, there was something in his eyes that made her hesitate. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension inside her. Luca's gaze shifted, and for a moment, Andrea could have sworn he was about to say something, but he just shook his head. "You'll find out when you get there," he replied. Andrea didn't press him further. She had learned not to push too hard when it came to Marco's inner circle. She followed Luca down the corridor to Marco's private office. The door was already open, and Marco was sitting behind his desk, his back to the door, looking out over the city. As she entered, Marco turned around and gestured for her to sit. There was something different in his demeanor today. He seemed more serious than usual. Andrea, he said, his voice low, I have a task for you. Something more delicate. Andrea sat down, her heart racing. What's going on? She asked again, this time more pointedly. Marco studied her for a moment, as if weighing whether to share everything with her. Then he spoke. There's been a breach in our operations. Someone in the family has been leaking information to our rivals. I don't know who yet, but I need you to find out. Andrea's mind raced. This wasn't a task she had expected. She had proven herself in the field, but this was something else entirely. A betrayal within their own ranks was the kind of thing that could tear the family apart. How do you want me to do this? She asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Marco looked at her, his eyes hard. I need you to gather information from within. Talk to the right people. Find the source, and make sure they don't slip away before we deal with them. This is crucial, Andrea. She nodded. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about protecting everything Marco had built. I'll take care of it, she said, her voice firm. Marco stood up and walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. I know you will, he said, his tone softening for just a moment. Then he stepped back, his demeanor shifting back to the cold, calculated mafia boss she had come to know. I trust you. Don't let me down. Andrea stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She was now tasked with uncovering a traitor in Marco's empire. She had no idea who it could be, but she knew one thing for sure. This was her chance to prove her loyalty in a way that was different from anything before. The next few days were filled with tense moments and quiet conversations. Andrea had to tread carefully, speaking to the right people without raising suspicion. She knew that one wrong move could cost her everything. Marco's trust, her life, or both. She spent hours in the shadows, listening, watching, and gathering whatever information she could. Every conversation felt like a test, and every move she made was calculated. She knew that Marco was counting on her, and failure was not an option. After a few days of digging, Andrea found herself standing in front of a man who had always been loyal to Marco. Vince, one of Marco's oldest associates. He was the one who handled a lot of the dirty work, but Andrea had always sensed that there was more to him than met the eye. She had never trusted him completely, but now, she couldn't afford to ignore him. Vince was sitting at a bar, nursing a drink, when Andrea approached. He looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he saw her. What do you want, Andrea? He asked, his voice rough from years of use. Andrea took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. We need to talk, she said quietly, sliding into the seat next to him. Vince raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. Andrea could feel the tension in the air as she spoke. I know something's been going on. I don't know who it is yet, but someone in the family is working against Marco. I need to know if you've heard anything. Vince didn't answer immediately. He took a long sip of his drink, his eyes focused on the glass in front of him. Finally, he looked up at Andrea, his gaze hard. You're asking the wrong person, he said. But Andrea could see the hesitation in his eyes. Are you sure about that? She pressed. Vince's lips tightened. I don't know anything, Andrea. And even if I did, I wouldn't be the one to tell you. Andrea felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in Vince's voice, something in his eyes that told her he knew more than he was letting on. But he wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. She stood up, her mind racing. She had just taken a step closer to finding the traitor, but the answers were still out of reach. The stakes had just been raised, and Andrea was more determined than ever to find out who was behind the betrayal. She had no idea how deep this ran, but she knew she couldn't stop until she uncovered the truth. Andrea's search for the traitor within Marco's organization had led her to more dead ends than she cared to count. But she was determined, more than ever, to uncover the truth. Every interaction, every conversation felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, yet Andrea knew one misstep could be catastrophic. It had been 3 days since her conversation with Vince at the bar. His cryptic response had haunted her. The implication that he knew something more but wasn't ready to share it lingered in her mind. She had returned to her quiet apartment each night, replaying the words he hadn't said, the hesitation in his eyes. But now, Marco had summoned her again. As Andrea entered Marco's office, the familiar tension in the air was thicker than usual. He wasn't sitting behind his desk like he usually did, surveying his domain. Today, he was standing by the window, staring out at the city skyline, a contemplative look on his face. She had gotten used to his powerful presence, but today there was something different, something urgent. "Close the door," Marco said without turning around, his voice low. Andrea did as instructed, taking a step closer to him. "What's going on?" she asked, though she already had a sinking feeling in her stomach. Marco didn't answer immediately. He seemed lost in thought. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the view outside. The quiet tension was almost unbearable. Finally, he spoke. "I've learned something," he began, his tone still calm, but with an edge to it. "There's a leak. Someone in my inner circle. Someone close." Andrea's heart skipped a beat. It was what she had feared, but hearing Marco confirm it made it all the more real. "Who?" she asked, her voice steady but her mind racing. Marco turned toward her, his expression cold, his gaze piercing. "That's what I need you to find out," he said. "I've got a few names in mind, but I can't trust anyone to dig deeper. This goes beyond what we've already discussed. I need someone who can get answers quietly. Someone who isn't afraid to step on a few toes." Andrea felt a rush of adrenaline. She had been hoping for a chance to prove herself, but this was different. This was a dangerous game. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said firmly, determined to show Marco that she could handle it. "Good," Marco replied. He then handed her a file from his desk, thick with documents and names. "These are the people I suspect, but I need you to dig deeper. Talk to the right people, the ones who know the truth." Andrea nodded and took the file. The weight of it felt heavier than just paper. This was the responsibility she had been waiting for, but it came with a risk she hadn't fully prepared for. As she left Marco's office, she felt the full weight of the situation settle on her shoulders. She couldn't fail. Not now. Andrea's first step was to meet with Luca. He had been a constant presence since her involvement with Marco's family, and while she had trusted him, there was something about his loyalty that felt too perfect, too unquestioning. She needed to know where his true allegiances lay. Andrea arranged a meeting with him in one of the city's quieter bars. It was dimly lit, with the faint smell of whiskey and cigar smoke in the air. Luca was already there when she arrived, seated in a booth in the back, his broad shoulders hunched forward as if he was deep in thought. When he looked up and saw her approach, his face softened. "Andrea," he said with a nod. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "We need to talk," Andrea replied, sitting down across from him. She didn't waste any time. "Marco has given me a new assignment. He thinks there's a traitor in the family, and I need to figure out who it is." Luca raised an eyebrow but didn't speak immediately. Andrea continued. "I need your help," she said, looking him straight in the eyes. "I need to know who's behind this, and I need to know what's really going on." Luca was silent for a long moment. The tension between them was palpable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I don't know who it is, Andrea, but I've been hearing things. Whispers. There's more going on than anyone realizes." Andrea leaned in, her pulse quickening. "What kind of whispers?" she asked. Luca's eyes flickered to the side, and for a moment, Andrea saw a flicker of doubt in his gaze. "I've heard that someone close to Marco has been making deals behind his back," he said cautiously. "But who? Who is it?" Andrea pressed. Luca hesitated, and Andrea's instincts told her something wasn't right. "Luca," she said, her voice firm, "this is important. If you know something, now is the time to tell me." Luca sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know who it is, but I've heard talk about Vince. He's been seen with people outside the family, and that's not something you ignore." Andrea's heart sank. Vince. The same man who had been so cryptic with her. The man she had been watching closely, but still wasn't sure she could trust. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Luca nodded. "I can't say for certain, but I think you should look into him. And if you want to get answers, you need to do it quickly. Time is running out, Andrea." Andrea sat back, processing what Luca had said. Vince. The possibility that he was the one betraying Marco shook her to the core. She had to get answers, but she knew the path ahead would be dangerous. Vince wasn't going to give up his secrets easily. But if there was any truth to what Luca had said, Andrea couldn't afford to wait any longer. She had to act now, before it was too late. The following evening, Andrea found herself walking through the quiet streets of the city, her mind filled with the name that had haunted her for days, Vince. After Luca's warning, she knew what she had to do. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. Marco had trusted her with a delicate mission, And now, more than ever, it felt like the weight of the family's future was on her shoulders. She had seen the loyalty in Marco's eyes when he had assigned her the task. She couldn't fail him now. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about proving that she could protect what she had fought so hard to be a part of. Vince, the man who had always been too careful, too elusive, had now become the key to everything. If he was the traitor, if he was the one leaking information to their rivals, Andrea knew she had to confront him. But how? How could she get him to reveal the truth? She had to be careful. The shadows of the mafia family were long, and secrets didn't stay hidden for long, especially not when they were as dangerous as betrayal. Andrea's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp ding of her phone. She glanced down and saw a message from Luca. Be careful. Vince knows you're looking into him. The blood drained from her face as she read the words. How did Luca know? Had he been watching her? Or had Vince somehow already found out she was digging into his affairs? Andrea felt a surge of panic, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to panic now. She had to think clearly. Vince was dangerous. If he suspected she was onto him, he might try to cover his tracks, maybe even make a move to silence her. But Andrea wasn't about to let that happen. She had to act fast. The next morning, she made her way to one of the family's more discreet locations, a small bar that served as a meeting point for trusted members. She had chosen it because it was quiet, away from the prying eyes of the city's streets. When she walked in, the familiar scent of whiskey and smoke filled the air. The low murmur of conversations echoed from the back, and she could hear the clinking of glasses. She scanned the room, searching for Vince. He wasn't hard to spot. He was sitting at a corner table, nursing a drink. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were alert, watching the room as always. Andrea approached him slowly, her mind racing with the plan she had worked out in her head. She couldn't afford to be careless. She had to catch him off guard. As she walked up to his table, Vince looked up, his expression unreadable. You've been busy, haven't you? He said, his voice low but tinged with something else, something Andrea couldn't quite place. I've been busy, she replied, taking a seat across from him. I've been hearing things, Vince. People are talking. Vince's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. People always talk. But this time, the talk is about you, Andrea said, leaning in slightly, her voice firm. I know you've been working with the rivals. I know you've been leaking information. Vince's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he leaned back in his chair. Is that so? He said, his tone laced with sarcasm. And where did you hear that? Andrea felt a cold chill run down her spine. He wasn't denying it, but he wasn't confirming it either. I've got eyes and ears everywhere, Vince, she said, her voice steady. And I know you've been making deals with people you shouldn't be. Vince studied her for a moment, his gaze intense. He wasn't looking at her the way he usually did, like a fellow member of the family. No, this time, his eyes were colder, more calculating. You're treading dangerous waters, Andrea, he said slowly. You don't know what you're getting into. Andrea's pulse quickened, but she didn't let him see it. I know exactly what I'm getting into, she replied, her voice firm. I'm not the one betraying Marco. I'm not the one putting everything at risk. Vince chuckled, but there was no warmth in the sound. You think you're the only one who's loyal? You think Marco's the only one who matters? His voice dropped lower, and for the first time, Andrea felt the weight of his words. You don't know what it's like to be in my position, he said, his gaze narrowing. You don't understand the sacrifices I've had to make. Andrea swallowed, the words hanging in the air like a weight. She had heard the whispers, the rumors about Vince's loyalty. She had seen the way he carried himself, too confident, too smooth to be completely trustworthy. But this was different. This wasn't just a man trying to cover his tracks. This was something deeper, something personal. So what now? Andrea asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Are you going to admit to what you've done? Vince's eyes flickered, and for a brief second, Andrea saw something that made her hesitate. Was it guilt? Or was it anger? He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. I've done what I had to do. And so have you. Andrea stared at him, confused by his words. Before she could respond, Vince stood up, his chair scraping across the floor. You don't know what you're dealing with, Andrea. But you will. Soon enough. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Andrea alone at the table. She sat there for a moment, the weight of his words pressing down on her. What had he meant? What had he been trying to tell her? Andrea's mind raced as she tried to piece it all together. But the truth was clear. Vince wasn't just a traitor. He was playing a much bigger game, and she had just become a pawn in it. Andrea sat alone at the bar long after Vince had left, her mind spinning with his cryptic words. You don't know what you're dealing with, Andrea. But you will. Soon enough. What had he meant by that? She had been so sure that confronting him would give her answers, but now she felt more uncertain than ever. She had thought she understood the stakes, Marco's empire, loyalty, and power. But after that conversation, it felt like she was only scratching the surface of something much deeper. She couldn't shake the feeling that Vince had been trying to warn her, not just about him, but about something bigger. The way he had looked at her, the mix of anger and fear, it was unlike anything she had seen from him before. It wasn't just about betrayal, it was about survival. The truth hit her hard. The mafia world wasn't just about loyalty and power. It was a world where everyone had their own motivations, their own secrets, and no one was ever truly safe. Marco had warned her that trust was earned, and that no one, not even those closest to him, could be fully trusted. But what if that extended to Marco himself? Andrea shook her head, trying to push the thought away. She had come this far because she believed in Marco. He had given her a chance to prove herself, and she couldn't let that go to waste. But she also knew she couldn't ignore what Vince had said. There was something about the way he spoke that made Andrea think there was more at play than just the typical power struggles. Marco had never mentioned the family's enemies in such detail, and now she was starting to wonder if there was more Marco wasn't telling her. Andrea's phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her train of thought. It was a message from Marco. I need you at the office. Urgent. Andrea didn't hesitate. She stood up, left a tip on the bar, and made her way to the elevator. As she headed to Marco's office, she felt the weight of the situation settle over her. Everything had been building to this moment. The conversations with Luca, the warning from Vince, and Marco's cryptic messages, it was all coming to a head. What did Marco need from her now? And what had Vince been trying to tell her? When Andrea entered Marco's office, he was already sitting behind his desk, his expression as unreadable as ever. He looked up as she entered, his eyes cold and calculating. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Andrea sat down, her heart racing. She had no idea what Marco had in mind, but she could tell by his demeanor that this was going to be another test. We have a problem, Marco said, his voice low. A big one. Andrea's mind raced. What kind of problem? Marco leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him. I've just received word that our enemies are making their move. The Vulkoff family is pushing hard to take control of the docks. They're making deals behind our backs, and I need you to find out who's feeding them information. Andrea's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a small leak. It was a full-scale attack on Marco's territory. Do you have any leads? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Marco nodded. I have a few suspicions, but I don't have proof yet. I need you to find out who's working with the Vulkoffs. If we don't stop them, we'll lose everything. Andrea took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Marco's words. She had thought her task was over, but now it seemed like it was just beginning. I'll get to work on it, she said, standing up. I'll need to talk to some people. Get some answers. Marco stood up as well, his eyes still locked on hers. Be careful, Andrea. This isn't just about loyalty anymore. It's about survival. His words hit her harder than she expected. Survival. It wasn't just about proving herself to Marco. It was about protecting everything she had fought for. Marco's empire wasn't just built on power, it was built on trust. And now that trust was crumbling. I won't let you down, Andrea said, her voice firm. Marco nodded, his gaze softening for a moment. I know you won't. You're stronger than you think. With that, Andrea left the office, her mind already racing with the task ahead. She knew she had to act fast. She had no idea who in the family was working with the Vulkoffs, but she knew one thing. She couldn't let them win. As she stepped into the cold night air, Andrea's resolve hardened. She was ready to do whatever it took to protect Marco's empire. Even if it meant uncovering secrets she wasn't ready to face. The path ahead was dangerous, but Andrea wasn't afraid. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Andrea spent the next several days in a state of quiet tension, working both in the shadows and in plain sight. Marco had asked her to investigate, and the weight of his request sat heavy on her shoulders. She had been with him long enough to know that betrayal within his circle could not go unpunished, but she was beginning to question everything. The Vulkoff family's aggressive push for control was one thing, but the deeper she dug, the more Andrea began to wonder if the real threat wasn't just from outside the family. As she sat in her small apartment one evening, poring over a stack of files Marco had given her, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that had taken root in her gut. She had spent countless hours talking to people, gathering intelligence, trying to piece together the puzzle that was Marco's empire. She had met with Rocco again, but he had offered little new information, only repeating the same things he had before. She needed to take a different approach. Her mind returned to Vince. His cryptic warnings, his odd behavior, the way he had seemed to know so much but wouldn't share anything. Andrea had tried to dismiss the possibility that Vince was involved in the betrayal, but the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like the pieces fit. She had no proof, but something about his silence was telling. She couldn't ignore the way he had looked at her, like he knew what she was trying to uncover. The next day, Andrea arranged to meet Vince again. This time, she wasn't going to let him get away with his evasions. She needed the truth, and she wasn't going to let him dance around her questions. They met at a different bar, one that was quieter, more secluded. Andrea arrived first, her nerves on edge. She couldn't afford to let Vince see her uncertainty. When he walked in, his usual calm demeanor was gone. There was a tension in the air, something Andrea hadn't noticed before. Vince wasn't smiling, and his eyes weren't the usual cold mask they had been. There was fear in them now, and Andrea knew that fear was not something she could ignore. He sat down across from her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Andrea leaned in, her voice steady. "We need to talk," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Vince's gaze flickered nervously, and he leaned back in his chair. "What's this about, Andrea?" he asked, his voice low. "I think you know exactly what it's about," Andrea replied, her eyes never leaving his. "The leaks. The Vulkoffs. I know you're involved. And I know you know more than you're letting on." Vince's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he just stared at her for a long moment, as if weighing his options. "You're getting too close, Andrea," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "You don't know what you're dealing with. There are things you don't understand." Andrea's heart pounded. "Then tell me, Vince," she said, leaning forward. "Tell me what I don't understand. Who's behind this?" Vince looked around the bar nervously, as if making sure no one was listening. "It's bigger than you think," he said, his voice low. "Marco's not the only one with enemies. There are people within the family who want him gone. People who are working with the Vulkoffs, but they're too deep for you to see." Andrea's stomach turned. She had suspected there was more to the story than just a simple power struggle, but hearing it from Vince's lips made everything feel so much more real. "Who?" she demanded. "Who are they?" Vince sighed and rubbed his face, his hands shaking slightly. "I can't tell you," he said, his voice full of regret. "But you need to back off. You're getting too close. If Marco finds out you're poking around like this, he'll have both of us buried." Andrea's mind raced. She could feel the walls closing in. This wasn't just about loyalty anymore. It was about survival. "If you don't tell me, Vince, I'll find out on my own," she said, her voice cold with determination. Vince shook his head, his eyes pleading. "Please, Andrea, you don't understand. This isn't just about you or me. This is about everything Marco has built. The family, the business. If this thing goes public, if Marco finds out what's been happening," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Andrea leaned back, considering his words. "So, you're telling me to back off?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "You think I can just walk away from this?" Vince didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Andrea took a deep breath, her thoughts racing. She could feel the weight of the decision she had to make. She could walk away, try to distance herself from the family, from Marco, and keep herself safe. Or she could push forward and risk everything. Her life, her position, and everything she had worked for. But as she sat there, staring at Vince, she realized that walking away was not an option. She had come too far. "I'm not backing off," Andrea said firmly. "You may be trying to protect me, but I don't need your protection. I need the truth." Vince's eyes widened, and he looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice trembling with urgency. Andrea shook her head. "No, Vince. The mistake is thinking I'll sit back and let this all fall apart. She stood up, ready to leave, but before she could turn away, Vince grabbed her arm. "Wait," he said, his grip firm but not forceful. "If you're going to keep pushing, you need to be ready for what's coming. People like me don't just walk away from this. You're in it now, whether you like it or not." Andrea stared at him, her heart racing. She knew exactly what he meant. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about surviving the game she had entered. And she wasn't about to back down. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty and tension for Andrea. The conversation with Vince had left a mark on her, but it also solidified her resolve. She couldn't back down now, not after everything she had seen and heard. The walls around her were closing in, but she wasn't about to let herself be swallowed by them. Marco had entrusted her with the truth, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even Vince, distract her from uncovering it. The task was clear: find the traitor. Find the ones who were working against Marco and threatening everything they had built. Andrea knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed allies, and she needed information, but more than that, she needed to stay ahead of those who were trying to stop her. Marco's empire wasn't just built on power, it was built on secrets, and Andrea was learning that the hard way. She spent her nights meeting with trusted members of the family, asking questions, watching for any signs of deceit. The further she dug, the more complicated everything became. But there was one person who had always remained in the background: Luca. He had been Marco's right hand for years, and while Andrea had always trusted him, the more she investigated, the more she wondered if Luca knew more than he had ever let on. It was late one night when she decided to confront him. They met at a quiet cafe, a place where they could talk without the prying eyes of the mafia world. When Andrea walked in, Luca was already sitting at a corner table, his back straight, eyes scanning the room. He looked up as she approached and nodded, signaling for her to sit. "You wanted to talk?" he asked, his tone neutral but with an underlying edge. Andrea sat down across from him, her mind racing. "I need to know where your loyalty lies," she said, her voice steady, yet carrying the weight of her suspicions. Luca raised an eyebrow, but his expression remained calm. "What do you mean?" "I'm trying to figure out who's working against Marco," Andrea continued. "Who's been feeding information to the Vulkoffs? And I need to know if you're part of it." Luca's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't speak right away. Instead, he took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving hers. Andrea held her breath, waiting for him to respond. "You think I'm the one betraying Marco?" Luca asked finally, his voice low, almost amused. Andrea nodded. "I don't know who else it could be," she said. "You've been close to Marco for a long time, but you've also been around the family's operations enough to know what's at stake. If you've been working with the Vulkoffs, I need to know." Luca set his drink down and leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed. But there was a shift in his expression, something darker, something more dangerous. "You're asking dangerous questions, Andrea," he said, his voice colder now. "I didn't come here to make enemies. I came here to protect what's ours." Andrea stared at him, searching his eyes for any sign of guilt or hesitation. She could feel the tension between them, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "So, what's the truth?" she asked. "Are you with Marco, or are you working with the enemy?" Luca let out a long, slow breath, as if contemplating his next words. "I've been loyal to Marco since day one," he said quietly, his tone dropping to something more personal, more serious. "But loyalty doesn't mean you don't make deals. It doesn't mean you don't play the game." Andrea's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tightening. Luca leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Marco's not the only one with power," he said. "You think he can protect this entire empire without making sacrifices? Without stepping on a few people along the way? He's been making deals with the Vulkoffs, with people outside the family, but he doesn't tell anyone. He keeps things in the dark because he doesn't want to admit that he's just as tangled in this mess as everyone else." Andrea's mind was racing. She had never imagined that Marco, the man who had trusted her, could be involved in something like this. But Luca's words were starting to make sense. Marco had never been completely transparent with her, and now Andrea wondered if that was a deliberate choice. "So, you're saying Marco's been playing both sides?" Andrea asked, trying to wrap her mind around the implications. Luca nodded slowly. "He's been trying to hold on to power, but in doing so, he's made enemies on both sides. The Vulkoffs want the docks, but they're not the only ones who want to take Marco down. And you, Andrea, you're getting caught in the middle of it. Andrea's stomach twisted. She had thought she was working for Marco, trying to protect the family, but now it seemed like she was working for a man who was just as much a part of the problem as anyone else. What do you want from me, Luca? She asked, her voice tinged with frustration. I want you to understand, Lucas said, his gaze softening slightly. Marco's not the man you think he is. He's not a hero. He's a businessman, just like the rest of us. And if you want to survive in this world, you have to learn how to play the game. You can't just be loyal to one side and expect to come out unscathed. Andrea sat there, stunned by Luca's words. He had just shattered her entire view of the family she had worked so hard to protect. Was Marco really the man she had believed him to be? Or was he just another player in the game, willing to sacrifice anyone who got in his way? The answers she had been searching for were starting to slip further and further away, and she knew that no matter which side she chose, there was no turning back. Andrea left Luca's office that evening, her mind swirling with new revelations. The weight of what he had said hit her harder than anything she had heard so far. Marco wasn't the man she thought he was, and the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. She had trusted him, believed in him, and now she wasn't sure if that trust had been misplaced. As Andrea walked through the darkened streets, her footsteps felt heavier than usual. The city's lights flickered in the distance, but they didn't seem as bright anymore. The shadows had grown longer, and the world around her felt much colder. She had thought she was protecting Marco's empire, but now it seemed like she was caught in a web of lies, betrayal, and dangerous games. How deep did Marco's involvement with the Vulkoffs go? How much of what he told her was true, and how much was a carefully constructed illusion? Andrea's thoughts were interrupted when her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Marco. Meet me at the usual spot. Now. Her heart skipped a beat. The urgency in his message was unmistakable. Andrea's mind raced. What was happening? Why did he need to meet her now? She had barely made it out of Luca's office when the message came, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. She made her way to the designated location, a quiet alley behind one of the family's businesses. When she arrived, Marco was already there, his silhouette visible in the shadows. He stood with his back to her, as if waiting for her to approach. Marco, Andrea said cautiously, her voice tense with the weight of everything she had learned. He turned around slowly, his face shadowed but his eyes sharp. You're late, he said flatly. I had to take care of something, Andrea replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She could feel the tension between them, thick and palpable. What's going on, Marco? What do you want from me? Marco stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. I need your help, he said quietly. Things are escalating. The Vulkoffs are making their move faster than I expected. I need you to get me the information I asked for. The names of the traitors in my organization. Andrea's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when Marco would finally give her the answers she needed. But something about the way he said it didn't sit right with her. He wasn't as confident as usual, and she could see the flicker of worry in his eyes. I've been working on it, Andrea said, trying to maintain control. But Marco, there's something I need to ask you. Something I need to understand. Marco's eyes narrowed. What is it? Andrea took a deep breath. She couldn't hold back anymore. I know about the deals you've been making with the Vulkoffs. I know you've been playing both sides. Is that true? The silence between them stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. Marco's expression darkened, and for a moment, Andrea thought he might deny it. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, he said, his voice laced with frustration. I've been doing what I need to do to keep control, to protect the family. Andrea's heart sank. This was worse than she had imagined. She had suspected it, but hearing him confirm it was another thing entirely. You're telling me you've been working with them all along? She asked, her voice tight. Marco nodded. It's not simple, Andrea. The Vulkoffs are powerful, and we can't ignore them. I had to make deals to ensure our survival. Andrea felt a wave of betrayal crash over her. Everything she had done, everything she had worked for, seemed meaningless now. And what about us? She asked, her voice cracking. What about your loyalty to the family? To me? Marco's eyes softened for a moment, but the hardness returned quickly. You think loyalty is enough to survive in this world? He asked, his voice rising slightly. Loyalty is a luxury, Andrea. In this business, you have to make hard choices. And sometimes, that means making deals with the enemy. Andrea took a step back, feeling the weight of his words settle on her shoulders. So, this whole time, I've been working for a man who doesn't even believe in loyalty, she asked, her voice trembling. Marco's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. Andrea could feel the betrayal in her bones. Everything she had believed about Marco, about the family, was slipping away. You're not the man I thought you were, she said softly, more to herself than to him. Marco reached out, grabbing her arm before she could turn away. Andrea, wait, he said urgently. I didn't bring you here to fight. I brought you here to ask for your help. We have to act fast. The Vulkoffs won't stop until they've taken everything. Andrea wrenched her arm free from his grip. And what happens when they've taken everything? She demanded, her voice rising. What happens when they take you, Marco? Will I still be here, cleaning up the mess you made? Marco's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else there too. Something Andrea couldn't quite identify. You're not just a pawn, Andrea, he said, his voice quiet now, almost pleading. I need you. I'm asking for your loyalty. Will you stand with me, or will you walk away? Andrea stood there for a long moment, staring at him. The words she had wanted to say, the words she needed to say, were stuck in her throat. She had thought she was in control. She had thought she knew where she stood. But now, everything was in question. She had to make a choice. And for the first time, Andrea wasn't sure which way to go. Andrea stood in the alley, facing Marco, her heart pounding as the weight of his words pressed heavily on her. She had never seen him like this, desperate, almost pleading. The man who had always commanded respect, who had built an empire with his own two hands, was now looking at her for help. His words had cut through the fog of uncertainty that had surrounded her for days, but they only left her with more questions. Loyalty was a luxury. Marco had admitted to working with the Vulkoffs, to making deals behind closed doors, and now he was asking for her loyalty in return. But at what cost? She had given everything to this family, her time, her effort, her belief in what Marco stood for. But now she was starting to realize that everything she had believed in might have been a lie. Andrea took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had to make a choice. She couldn't keep standing at the crossroads, unsure of which path to take. She had trusted Marco, but Marco had trusted the Vulkoffs, and that trust had put everything at risk. She looked at Marco, his face etched with concern, his hands clenched at his sides. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way his muscles tightened as he waited for her response. She knew what he wanted from her. He wanted her to choose his side. But Andrea wasn't sure she could anymore. Marco, she said, her voice calm but firm, you've put us all in danger. You've put me in danger. How can I trust you after everything I've learned? Marco's eyes flashed with frustration, but his voice remained steady. You think I haven't made sacrifices? You think I've just been playing this game for fun? I did what I had to do to protect this family, to protect you. Andrea shook her head, disbelief creeping into her voice. Protect me? By making deals with the enemy? By betraying the very people who trust you? Marco stepped forward, his hand reaching out as if to grab her, but Andrea took a step back, her eyes never leaving his. I didn't have a choice, he said, his voice tight. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. This is how the game works, Andrea. This is how. We survive. Andrea looked at him, her chest tightening. She had heard the same excuses before, from people just like him. People who thought the ends always justified the means. But she wasn't sure she could keep living in that world. You're asking me to choose, Marco, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I'm not sure I can. Marco's face fell, the hardness in his eyes softening for a moment. You think I wanted to drag you into this? You think I wanted to keep you in the dark? But you're in this now, Andrea. You're part of this family. And that means you stand with me, no matter what. Andrea felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She had worked so hard to prove herself, to show Marco that she was worthy of his trust, of his loyalty. But now it felt like everything she had worked for had been built on a foundation of lies. I can't just forget what I've learned, she said softly. I can't ignore the fact that you've been lying to me. Marco stared at her, his expression unreadable. The silence between them stretched, heavy and thick. Finally, Marco spoke, his voice low. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to pull you into a war? But you're a part of it now, Andrea. And I need you. He reached out again, his hand resting gently on her arm. I need you to help me fix this. We can't let the Vulkoffs win. I won't let them take everything we've built. Not without a fight. Andrea closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision crushing down on her. She had always known that loyalty was a dangerous thing, but she hadn't expected it to feel this heavy. "I'm not sure I can do this anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Marco's grip on her arm tightened, a flicker of desperation in his eyes. "You can, Andrea. You're stronger than you think. You've already proven that. Don't walk away now." She pulled her arm away gently, stepping back. The pain of the moment settled over her like a cloud, blocking out everything else. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, that the lies and betrayals didn't matter. She had to make a choice. "I need time," Andrea said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I need time to think." Marco looked at her, his face hardening once again. "Fine," he said, his tone colder now. "But remember, Andrea, you can't sit on the sidelines forever. This is bigger than you think." He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Andrea standing there alone, the weight of his words pressing heavily on her. As she watched him disappear into the night, Andrea felt the walls around her close in once again. She had to make a choice. And this time, it was a choice that could cost her everything. The days that followed were filled with silence, tension, and difficult choices. Andrea spent most of her time alone, turning over the events in her mind, unable to find a clear path forward. Marco had made his position clear, but Andrea was stuck, paralyzed by the gravity of everything she had learned. The weight of his betrayal, the lies, the manipulations, pressed on her shoulders like a 1,000-pound burden. Could she stand by him, knowing what he had done? Could she turn away from everything she had worked for? She wasn't sure anymore. Days passed in a blur as Andrea tried to focus on the task ahead, uncovering the traitor. But every conversation she had, every person she met, seemed to be a distraction from the truth she knew she had to face. The Vulkoffs were moving quickly, and the family's enemies were closing in from every side. Yet, the more Andrea thought about it, the more she realized the true battle wasn't with the Vulkoffs. It was with the very people she had trusted. One afternoon, after a long meeting with Marco's top advisors, Andrea walked back to her apartment, her thoughts clouded with confusion and doubt. She had given Marco every ounce of her loyalty, but now, she had to decide if that loyalty was worth the cost. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the screen lighting up with a new message. It was from Luca. "Meet me at the usual spot. We need to talk." The urgency in his message made Andrea's heart race. She had been waiting for something like this, but part of her dreaded the conversation she knew was coming. As she made her way to the meeting spot, her mind raced. What did Luca know? Had he figured out that she was questioning everything? The dimly lit bar where they usually met felt different tonight. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. When Andrea walked in, Luca was already there, sitting at their usual table, a glass of whiskey in front of him. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "You've been avoiding me," Luca said as she sat down, his voice steady but with an edge. "I've had a lot to think about," Andrea replied, keeping her tone even, despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "I know what you're going through," Luca said, his gaze never leaving her. "You've been given a lot to process, and I get it. But you can't let your doubts get in the way of what we need to do next." Andrea's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her heart pounding. Luca leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Marco's in trouble, Andrea. The Vulkoffs aren't just looking to take over the docks. They're looking to take over everything. And if you don't act now, everything we've fought for will be gone." Andrea's mind raced. Was Luca playing her? Or was he telling the truth? She couldn't tell anymore. "What do you want from me?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. Luca's eyes softened, but his expression remained intense. "I want you to make the right choice. Marco's not the only one who's been lying. There's more going on here than you think." Andrea looked at him, confusion and frustration building inside her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. Luca hesitated before speaking again. "Marco has always played both sides. But now, he's made a deal with the Vulkoffs. He's put everything we've built in jeopardy, and he doesn't even know it." Andrea's stomach dropped. This was what she had feared. Marco had always been a man who would do anything to hold on to power, but this was something else entirely. "So, you're telling me Marco's working with the enemy?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Luca nodded. "He doesn't want you to know, but it's the truth. He's been making deals with them behind your back, behind all of our backs. And now, The Vulkoffs are closer than ever to taking everything. Andrea felt her chest tighten. She had been loyal to Marco, believed in him, but this was a betrayal. She wasn't sure she could come back from. I can't be a part of this anymore, she said quietly, more to herself than to Luca. I don't know who to trust. Luca reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. His touch was firm, but not aggressive. You don't have to trust anyone right now, Andrea. You just have to make a choice. Stand with Marco, or stand with the truth. The family needs you, but the truth needs you more. Andrea looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she had to make. She had always known loyalty had its price, but she had never imagined it would come to this. I need to know the truth, she said, her voice steady. And I need to know if Marco is really the man I thought he was. Luca nodded, then stood up, his gaze never leaving hers. I'll get you the answers you need, he said, his voice low and serious. But you have to act fast. The longer you wait, the more you risk losing. Andrea sat there for a long moment after Luca left, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She knew what she had to do. The choice wasn't just about loyalty to Marco or the family. It was about her future, about who she wanted to be in a world filled with lies and power struggles. As the night stretched on, Andrea felt a resolve settle in her chest. She would find the truth, no matter what it cost her. She couldn't live in the shadows any longer. The next move was hers, and she was going to make it count. In this captivating tale, we dive deep into the world of loyalty, betrayal, and difficult choices, all while uncovering the darker side of family loyalty in the context of a powerful mafia empire. As the main character, Andrea confronts the reality of her own involvement in this dangerous world. She finds herself torn between loyalty to Marco, the man she's trusted, and the unsettling truth of the power dynamics at play. With a looming sense of distrust, Andrea must navigate the shifting tides of allegiance, uncover hidden secrets, and decide where her loyalty truly lies. This gripping narrative takes the reader through twists and turns that resemble some of the most intense romance stories, where love, betrayal, and ambition intertwine. As she gets deeper into the mystery surrounding Marco and the Vulkoffs, Andrea must weigh the cost of her decisions and the potential loss of everything she's fought for. The path she must take will lead her into uncharted waters, and just like in the best romance stories, she faces an emotional roller coaster that will test her beliefs and loyalty to the core. What will Andrea do when the line between right and wrong becomes blurred, and how will she reconcile her feelings with the truth? These elements, combined with the suspense of mafia intrigue, create a captivating narrative perfect for anyone who enjoys romance stories with complex characters and high stakes. Andrea's journey unfolds with tension, passion, and heartbreak, making this a must-read for fans of romance stories who enjoy a mix of thrilling suspense and deep emotional conflict.